Yellow creature gobbles dots while being pursued through maze by monsters.
How you doing, everyone? You just caught me playing a little bit of Space Invaders on my TV Space Invader-y thing. But welcome to the very first episode of 2023. Now what I'm going to do today is what I'm going to call an 8 bits in the basement retrospective. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a little look at an arcade cabinet I built years and years ago. This is a project I started in 2015 and it took me all of 3 years to do because, well, I went kind of slow at it. But the point of all that is I built this cabinet long before I ever had a YouTube channel, so I don't actually have any footage of doing this at all. So all I can really do is show you the finished product and kind of walk you through some of the bits and pieces I did. So we'll jump right in. The very first thing I had to do was I needed to find plans to build a nice cabinet. And what I had my little heart set on was a Bally Midway 1980s Pacman cabinet. It's kind of classic design. So I had a look on the internet and I found an excellent site called jacobud.com. Now they don't have an awful lot of information on that site, but what they do have, they have in spades. And well, the main part of it is arcade cabinet plans that they have. So I downloaded their plans, a little piece of A4 paper. I printed them out, but that's great. I had the shape and I had the dimensions and whatnot. But I wanted to build a full-size cabinet. So the very first thing I did was I took a compass, a ruler, a pencil, and a piece of black paper, and I redrew these plans just on regular paper to a kind of a small scale to make sure that the measurements worked. And once I was satisfied that that worked, I got myself loads of wallpaper, and I had to scale up some of my tools. So instead of a compass, I used a piece of string and a pencil. And yeah, a large ruler and stuff like that, and I just traced the plans out again to full scale on the floor of the kitchen. And what I ended up with were these. Using wallpaper and also using those tools like I told you before, I managed to make myself a full set of scaled up plans that you probably can't see because I'm not zoomed out enough. But these are they, and I'll give you a better look in just a moment. Now, this was easy enough to do, but the next thing I needed to do was I needed to put these plans down on a piece of wood. So, I'm going to show you some of the bits and pieces that I used. Now, a lot of this stuff I don't have anymore because like nearly 5 years ago I started making the cabinet. So, this here is the wood I used to build the cabinet from, or most of the cabinet from. This is 19mm MDF, or 3/4 inch medium density fiberboard. And it's been a little water damaged. It's been down here for a while. But basically, you will see that one side of it has a groove, and the other side of it has a tongue. And the tongue fits into the groove so that you can join multiple sheets together. Now these sheets were massive. They were like 2 meters, 40 centimeters by, I can't remember if it's 60 centimeters, I think, wide. They were plenty tall enough, but they weren't wide enough to build a cabinet from. So what I did was I bought 6 of these sheets in all. I needed 3 sheets to make the 2 side pieces. The way I did it was I took 1 sheet and I cut it right down the middle lengthways. And then I glued one side of it to a full sheet and the other side of it to another full sheet. And I ended up with 2 sheets that were a sheet and a half wide, if that makes any sense to you at all. Now I had sheets that were big enough to make the side parts from. So what I did was I put 1 sheet on top of the other, laid down on the ground nicely, and I laid these wallpapery plans on top. Now this wallpaper I used, and this is genius. The cheaper the wallpaper you buy, the thicker it is. That's something that I discovered. Expensive wallpaper is really thin and cheap wallpaper is really thick. And when you're doing pattern making or anything like that, thick wallpaper is what you want because it can survive manipulation. And not only that, but when it's laid down on top of something like this, you can trace around it with a pencil very, very easily. So when I removed my plans, I had a perfect drawing of what I wanted to cut out on this board. And then what I did was I used a jigsaw and a handsaw to cut around that line. And that way I got two sides of an arcade cabinet that were exactly the same because they were cut at the same time. Just like a tailor would cut fabric to make a suit.
But these here are the plans that I drew out originally on the wallpaper. So I just wanted to give you a closer look to show you some little tricks I used along the way. So number one, you'll notice that I have a flap here at the bottom going right the way along, and I've also got one here at the side as well, running right the way up to the top there. Now the idea behind those, and it worked quite well, was that once I had the two pieces of wood together, this guy went on top and those flaps folded over. This one here on the bottom and this one here on the side, and I pretty much kept it right in place where it needed to be so that if it moved or anything I could put it right back exactly where it was before. Now, just to show you the plans a little bit better, I put them on wallpaper, and again, like the wood I was using, the wallpaper wasn't quite wide enough, so I used painter's tape here, or masking tape as we call it, in order to stick the wallpaper together on the front and the back, if you can see it there too, just to keep it solid so that I could move it around. And the lines that I have here are pretty much what you've seen on the arcade cabinet themselves. This here, from this point here to this point here, is where our control panels are. So we've got our joystick and we've got our buttons there. And then from here up to there is where our TV lives. That's the TV screen. And this one going across this way, that's where the speakers are, with the little sound volume knob as well. And then this here's the top part. And from here up to this point here is where we have our marquee. So this is where our lights and stuff go. But that's pretty much the only plan you really need, because you'll get all the rest of the measurements and you'll get all the rest of the angles and whatnot off of this for building the rest of the cabinet.
That is how I made the side parts. Now, in order to put everything together afterwards, because the rest of the parts that were needed were more or less square pieces of MDF, I used lats. Now, this isn't one of the original lats. It's much, much bigger. The lats I used originally were 1 inch by 1 inch, or 25mm by 25mm. And using the plans again, I could mark on my pieces exactly where the lats should go and draw them in. And then I could cut the lats and screw them to this board. And it served a double purpose. It strengthened the piece and a half that had been glued on, because the lat transcended both pieces and was screwed in. And not only that, but it provided somewhere where I could screw in the other pieces that I would put on top. Now, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, don't worry, because what we're going to do right now is we're going to head upstairs to where I have that arcade cabinet, and we're going to have a little look at it. I'll show you all the pieces on the inside, and I'll also show you in more detail the construction that I used to put it together. So let's head up there right now. I'm sorry for the weird camera angle. I really hate turning the phone this way, but I can't fit the cabinet in if not. But this is my interpretation of a 1980s Bally Midway Pacman cabinet. And just to give you a sense of scale on the beast, here I am in behind it. Now this guy here, she's measuring in at 5'7.5" tall, which is just ever so slightly taller than I am, and 2'8" at its widest point here. It's pretty much the same as the original cabinet, but I did make a few little changes to it just to make it a little better, a little easier to use. The very first difference you see is that the original Pacman cabinet had one joystick in the middle and a player 1 and player 2 button. This guy I've put 2 joysticks and 12 buttons so that we can play a variety of different games and 2 people can play some of them at once. The other difference, or one of the other differences anyway, is on the original cabinet, around the TV screen and around the controllers, there were stickers explaining how to play the game along with some artwork. Now I haven't gone for that. I just painted the controllers and I stuck stickers around the screen. because it was cheaper to do that way. I didn't, however, skimp when it came to the Marquee, because it's the first thing you see. When the thing is turned on, this is lighted up, it's the very first thing you see. So I decided to go for Pacman Marquee. However, on the sides of it, I did skimp. I didn't pay hundreds of euros for the full vinyl artwork. I decided just instead to get some yellow paint that pretty much matched the canary yellow of the original cabinet and paint it that way. So that's pretty much an overview of the cabinet. So what I'll do is I'll move the phone in here and we're going to have a look at all the individual components within it. Okay, so when I built this cabinet, I tried to make everything within it modular so that it could be easily repaired or replaced if ever anything went wrong. So the very first module we'll have a look at is the control panel that I have here. Now this is probably the most expensive part of the cabinet, well, that I paid for anyway. I spent €50 on a dual arcade controller setup, and what it consisted of was 2 joysticks and 18 buttons. So there were 2 red, well there was actually 4 red, 4 green, 4 blue, 4 yellow, and a player 1 and player 2 star. Now I'll show you, this guy removes quite easily because, as I say, I tried to make the whole thing modular. And here on the bottom what you'll see is the 2 joysticks that I've put in. Now I countersunk them because the MDF is 3/4 inch, and if I just laid these in on top of the MDF without actually making a square for them to fit into the shafts of the joystick, would have been quite short. So that's just a little extra thing I did. But this whole setup is controlled by this, which is a Zenmo USB controller board. And basically it registers a short to ground anytime that a button is pressed or a joystick is moved in a direction, and it converts it to USB signals that are sent to a Raspberry Pi or a PC or any other device that has a USB port, more or less. So you could use this setup with a PC or a Mac or anything else, really. The way I'm keeping this guy in so it doesn't fall out is I put these 2 90-degree aluminium little brackets so that when it sits in, it sits tightly against the edge here and can't fall out. So the next thing I'm going to show you is my solution for a screen inside in this cabinet. So it's no secret, I decided to use an LCD TV. But before we get into that, I'll show you the way I've protected it. First of all, I'm protecting its screen while it's in there from dust and scratches and all kinds of other damage, just using a sheet of plexiglass. And to make it look nice while it's in there, what I've done is I have taken a little piece of backing board for, it's really for, I suppose, cabinets or bookcases or whatever. And what I did was I cut it to size to fit in there, and I also cut the shape of the screen itself in the center. Then I painted it black and I stuck a few stickers on it just to kind of make it look nice. And that is protecting, well, it's not protecting, it's actually making the whole thing look a lot better than it would otherwise. But when it comes to the screen inside in this is an LG 19-inch 4:3 format LCD TV. The thing about it is, it's one of the earlier generation LCD TVs, and that posed one little problem because the newer ones are backlit by LEDs, which means that they run kind of cool. Whereas this guy is backlit by, I don't know, fluorescent bulbs of some kind, so it gets kind of hot. So to try and alleviate that getting hot problem, I removed it from its plastics before I put it in here, and I also strung a fan or 2 around the back of it. Okay, so here is my monitor module, I suppose, taken out of the cabinet. And like I say, I tried to make this so that it would be easy to replace pieces that were in it. But this monitor, like I say, was an LG 19-inch 4:3 aspect ratio monitor. And you'll see that I've turned it kind of on its side because the original Pacman cabinet is kind of a long screen. You know, you've usually got the 3x4 and this part to be the bottom of the monitor and this part the side. But Pacman and some of the other games from back in the day have the monitors switched around, or the TV switched around, so it's actually longer than it is wide. So that's what I was going for in building this cabinet. So that's the way I installed it in. But I just used a piece of MDF. I cut a space for the monitor to slip in, and then using some of these tabs on the monitor that were originally joined to the plastic I removed, I used those as kind of cradle points. So I cut little channels so that it would sit in and kind of just hang there in the wood itself. But then to be sure that it didn't fall right the way through, what I did was, if I can turn this around because this risks falling out now because it really is only cradled in there. What I did was I used pieces of wood and screws here to kind of give it something it could lay against again. And like I say, you could put another monitor in here with slight modification, you know, but that's the way I did that. Now, also I've installed some fans here. This one here I don't use anymore because it's not needed, but it was drawn air across the top of the monitor, and it did actually succeed in reducing the temperature a bit, but it really wasn't needed. This guy here, however, is a 12-volt fan, and I have him running, blown air onto the PSU of the TV here, and it seems to keep everything reasonably cool. The TV is still powered from its own power supply here, so it's got a plug coming out especially for the TV, and this TV has a couple of different connections. It's got S-Video, it's got a VGA connector, it's got a SCART connector, and it's also got our composite connectors, and they're the ones I'm using. So I'm using a composite video in order to get a picture from the Raspberry Pi that I'm using into this TV. So as you can see, it keeps wanting to fall out of the wood that I have it in here. But it really is only gravity that's keeping this monitor in place. So with the control panel and the TV removed, the cabinet is very empty. All we see here is a power supply at the back, which I'll show you in a couple of moments. But what I want to show you here is just at the back of the cabinet. This is over the screen. And this is where I installed around the back the speakers and also the little amplifier that I'm using, so that I can adjust the volume or turn off the sound completely. Now, this again, there's a piece of MDF with a couple of holes drilled in it to accommodate the speakers and whatnot. And then I put, again, like I did with the little facade that I put around the TV there, or the bezel, I cut a piece of thin wood, like you'd use for the back of a cupboard or whatever, and I just drilled this hole pattern here to cover the speakers to make it look some way nice. And here in the very middle, I installed a little knob. Well, it's actually potentiometer from the amplifier around the back, but I put a little knob on it so that I could turn on and adjust the volume and turn it back down again. So it's really a very kind of simple, just little aesthetic setup here. But when we get around the back, I'll show you that in a little more detail. So finally at the front, what we have is we have our Marquee. Okay, so the Marquee itself is probably the most prominent part of an arcade cabinet. It was the part that was supposed to catch your eye and attract you over to play the game. And because of that, I didn't really want to skimp on it. I wanted to try and do it as good as I possibly could. So I bought the vinyl for this on eBay. I'll put a link in the description for any of the parts that I bought new. And the way I used it was I stuck it onto some of the clear perspex, exactly the same stuff that I put over the TV screen in order to protect it. And I just slotted it in behind a couple of light bulbs. Now the way I slotted it in was I got two pieces of L-shaped aluminium. I drilled a few holes in one side of them so that I could screw it into the cabinet, and I painted it black. I'll show that to you in a little detail in a moment. And I put 3 light bulbs into the back, or in behind, so that it would shine out. So with the 3 screws removed, this section here comes right off, and you can see, well, I hope you can see, where I've pierced the 3 holes here before I painted this aluminium piece black. And this guy here, he just sits down into it like this. So I put a little piece of black tape here along the back because my measurements weren't actually fantastic, so there was a little bit of light shining through. So I just put a little bit of black electrical tape along the back in order to make it look like, you know, it was done properly. But that there is the Pacman thingy stuck onto a piece of perspex like that. So that's how I achieved that one. So when it comes to lighting up the back of the cabinet, these are 3 little kind of LED lights that would be used in a kitchen spot or whatever. And again, I found these real cheap in a bargain bin in an electric store. So I picked up the 3 of them. I think it cost me €1 for all 3 of them. But what I did was, again, I took a piece of MDF and I just spaced out 3 holes, kind of equidistant, and I drilled holes in them so that these guys would fit in comfortably. They can easily be popped out and replaced if needs be. Okay, so here's what the cabinet generally looks like from the back. It's all closed up. except for a little slit there at the midsection, which kind of lets airflow through. Now, what I was going to do was I was going to cover that up as well and drill a few holes in it. But in the end of it, seeing as that's kind of up against the wall the whole time, I figured it was better to have it wide open like that to let the maximum air flow through where it was more or less needed. But anyway, we can remove the top section to allow us access to the innards of the cabinet, more or less. So I told you before that I had 3 light bulbs, which you see there, the backs of them. And they're little kind of bayonet-y fellas, or they've got 2 little spikes on them, one positive and one negative. So what I did was I daisy chained the positive spike together and the negative one as well, and then I just joined them up to a 12-volt power source coming from an ATX power supply, which I'll show you there in a moment. And what happens is, as soon as I turn on the cabinet, 12 volts is supplied to those 3 bulbs and they light up immediately. There's nothing more to it than that. I have no control over it. When the cabinet's on, it's turned on, and when the cabinet's off, they're turned off. And that's as easy as that gets. Moving the camera down a little bit, what I can show you here is the sound system that I have going. Now, it looks kind of impressive, but to be honest, it's not really all that much. These are 2 gigantic speakers that are overkill. Now, again, I found these in a secondhand kind of charity store, and I picked them up for, I think, €5 for the 2. Again, like I did with the TV, I stripped them out of their plastic boxes and I just bolted them or screwed them into the cabinet here, just on a piece of backing. And what they are is, like I said, they're overkill. They've got 2 speakers on each side, which they really don't need. They're 2 8-ohm speakers, and they've also got some kind of a little board with each of them as well. But anyway, what I did was I just wired those into a simple 5-volt amplifier. And this guy, as far as I know, is based on an LM386 chip. But what I did was I connected these speakers to the left and right output of this. And then the inputs are going down to my Raspberry Pi down here. This is the guy that's running the whole show. This is the central core of the unit. This is the computer that's kind of in it. And it is just a regular Raspberry Pi, and it's running RetroPie. That's all it's doing, but quite an old version of it because I haven't updated this since 2018. It's running away fine. Now, what I've done is I'm not choosing the HDMI port on it because TV doesn't have one. So the back of a Raspberry Pi generally has test points on it. They're marked like PP1 to PP40, depending on what revision of board you have. This guy here is a Raspberry Pi B Plus. So it really is about as powerful as a Raspberry Pi Zero, but it has some extra outputs on it. But it's nothing special. It really is kind of base level, entry level for this kind of a job. But what I've done is, using test points on the back, I have taken my audio left and right and I've brought them into that amplifier there. And for the video connection, I found the composite video test point plus a ground test point on the back, and I've brought those out to this yellow guy here, which is a female RCA connector, just plugged into the AV on the TV that I showed you earlier. And that is pretty much it. I've got the USB from the control panel plugged into the back of it here, and this guy here isn't necessarily needed. It's a Wi-Fi dongle so that I can easily update the system, but like I say, I haven't done it in years. Now, I decided to supply power to this using a little USB micro connector, which I just snipped off and wired directly into the 5-volt of an ATX power supply in order to power it. Now, I could have powered it through the GPIO pins here. There's a 5-volt GPIO pin, but if I had it done it that way, I'd be bypassing the power protection that's built into the Raspberry Pi. And that's because the Raspberry Pi has a type of fuse in it, a poly fuse. And if ever the voltage goes above 5 volts, this poly fuse will kick in and protect the board. And the way the poly fuse works is, once it goes off, it'll stop current coming in for a length of time until it resets itself. So by connecting power into the USB port on the Raspberry Pi, I have the protection of the poly fuse. Were I to power it any other way, I wouldn't have that protection. But that is the Raspberry Pi in there. And the very final piece that makes up the whole puzzle is ATX2 power supply. Now, this is nothing special at all. It's just a run-of-the-mill 450 watt ATX power supply. and it's got a connector on it here that plugs into the motherboard of a computer. It's got 24 pins on it, more or less, to go into the motherboard. But from this, I can quite easily take 12 volt, 5 volt. There's also minus 12 volt available on it as well, and 3.3 volts. But for this particular build, all I need is 5 volt and 12 volt. So I'm using 5 volt from it to power the Raspberry Pi, and I'm using 12 volt to power the fan that's in here. It is also taking 12 volt up to the light bulbs in the Marquee as well, but this is the easiest way to power it. Okay, so this is a rare time that the cabinet is more or less completely taken apart, so I'm going to make the most of it, and I'm going to show you the construction of this cabinet more or less as I did it. So I explained to you before that the side panels are made using a sheet and a half that I glued together. You see the join for this side right here. So that's a half sheet, and this here is a full sheet. Now it's glued together, so it's kind of solid, but in order to make it even more solid, I've got many of these lats running across that are screwed in order to give it extra rigidity. So I've got 2 of them here. Up on the top, I've got a further 2. I've got 1 here, and I've got 1 here. And these lats, of course, also serve to screw these pieces in place. And down in the bottom here, where I've got the door at the front, I've got more lats at the very bottom, in the middle, and this lat here. So the whole thing is kept together quite rigidly that way. And there are lats running down vertically at the back of the cabinet as well, and here in the door at the front, so that I can keep it solid that way along as well. So that's pretty much the construction on it. There's no kind of rocket science in there. It's very simple. Glue, screw, and that's what's holding the whole lot together. What I want to show you is this that I forgot about when I was upstairs filming. This here is my T-molding that's used on the sides of the cabinet, and it's really needed to set the cabinet off, because I mean, if not, it's just going to look a little bit crap without something nice to finish it on the front. So this stuff is cheap. It's made out of plastic. You can find it in many different colors: blue, yellow, red, black, you name it. They pretty much got the color you want. And I'll put a link in the description to where I bought this stuff. But in order to install it, because it's T-molding, it's got a little kind of machined part here that will fit into a groove, or a little groove that is cut in the wood, and it holds in place mechanically. Now, you need to create that groove in the wood yourself in a circumstance like this. And looking on eBay, looking on the web, they all said you need a little router that you can use and easily cut this groove out, and it works great. And I'm sure it does. But even to rent a router costs quite a bit here where I am anyway. So I had to find a different solution. And the solution I came up with was actually, well, it was quite easy after a little bit of thought. I had everything I needed here in the basement. The first thing I used was a mortise gauge. Now, a mortise gauge is a tool that carpenters use in order to cut like a placement for a lock in a door, for example. What I did was I set my mortise gauge so that I could find the exact center point of the 19mm MDF. And once I had done that, I traced a nice little line right down the middle, so I knew where I had to cut my mark. And then all I did was progressively widen that mark bit by bit. And the very first thing I used was a box cutter, I believe as it's called in the US, or a Stanley knife as we call it in Ireland or the UK, just to kind of mark that line a little better. And then I used a thin saw, working out progressively to a large rip saw in order to get the trench I was cutting deep enough to accept this molding that I was going to put in. And then I just put the molding in with a little bit of cloth over it and a wooden mallet in order to knock it in, and it stayed in place lovely. And that worked out actually fantastically. So that's how I put my mold into my arcade cabinet, and I think it gives it a nice little finish. Anyway, I don't know if we're finished now yet or not, but I think we might head back up to the arcade cabinet again. I don't even know what I'm saying. And we'll look at it working. We'll play some games on it. How about that? Let's get to it. Okay, so you'll remember I showed you that this cabinet has 2 cables hanging out of the back of it, one for the TV and one for absolutely everything else. Well, what I did was I plugged those 2 cables into an extension lead. So one of those extension block things. And the beauty of it is this little foot pedal is actually the switch to turn on that extension lead. So all I have to do To turn on the entire arcade cabinet is to press this with my foot. Just before we do that, what I want to show you is, you've seen the top part of the cabinet and the whole bottom of it is empty. So let me show you what's in behind this door. I've used this guy as storage. What we have in here is 11.5 cubic feet of storage for whatever the heck you want. And at the moment what we're using it for are board games and cards and all that kind of stuff, play cardy stuff. But what would be fantastic is to put a fridge in it that would plug into the power supply thing as well and could stay on the whole time, filled with beer. Wouldn't that be cool down in the basement? I think so. Anyway, let's turn this on and I'll show you how it works. So, as soon as I press the button, it gives a little click in order to let us know that the amplifier is on, the marquee lights up, and the screen comes on. It takes about 50 seconds to boot up in all. So once this cabinet starts up, what it's running is Emulation Station, and the actual cover for it is RetroPie. And the way I've set up RetroPie here is with this skin here. It's a comic book skin that looks kind of nice, I thought, when the system starts up. So RetroPie is capable of having all kinds of emulators in there. You can have them for all the old retro systems and also for arcade systems through MAME. So I decided just to use MAME on this system. There are no other emulators in there, and that way this is like purely an arcade cabinet and nothing else. When it starts up, it tells me I've got 2,380 games available to me. Now they're there, I can pick them, but they don't all work, but a lot of them do. I'll be honest, I haven't played all those. There's only maybe 10 or 12 that I play fairly regularly. But the way I've set up this cabinet, so it's easy as possible to use, is I've got the first button here is to select. So to select MAME, for example, I press the red button and I'm into the list of games. If I want to go back, I press the second button and that brings me back to where I was. The third button gives me special functions to shut down the system and to play around with volume levels if I want to. But the fourth button here is fairly handy. When I press it, it takes a little second to come up, but it'll let me kind of make lists of games by publisher and by manufacturer and all that kind of stuff. But also it'll let me jump to games starting with M, for example, or starting with N and all that kind of stuff. So I can find the game I'm looking for fairly quickly. So I'll just show you here what Mr. Do is an example. So we'll go to N because Mr. Do is nearly at the end of the M's. So going up the way here, I can select Mr. Do. We'll go for Mr. Do Bug Fixed here. I press the red button, that'll select it, and that's all it takes. That'll start up this game. There's no more to it than that. And after about 10 seconds, here's the game ready to be played. Now, it's asking me to put in a coin, and then I'm going to have to select one player start. Now, like I said before, I've got 6 buttons for player 1, 6 buttons for player 2. I had the other buttons and stuff, but I figured I didn't really have room to put them on the cabinet. So the way I got around that was I decided to use button combinations, because MAME will let you press a couple of different buttons together in order to do something. So in order to put in a coin for player 1, we press the bottom red button and the bottom green button. That puts in a coin for player 1. The same thing will work to put in a coin for player 2. And player 1 start is the bottom red with the bottom blue. Player 2 start is the same thing over the other side. And here we are playing our game as if we were in an arcade after putting money into the machine. If I want to put up the volume, all I have to do is turn the knob here on top, or I can turn it down again in order to put the volume at the level I want it at. And that's pretty much it. I can play games to my heart's content. Now, to get out of the game that you're playing, I decided again to use the button combinations, but I said I'd use a combination that maybe you wouldn't hit by accident while playing a game. So I decided all 3 bottom buttons along with the blue button on top, just on the player 1 side. And that'll bring me back into the menu here again. So that's pretty much it. I can select another game and play on again. But when I want to shut down, what I need to do is I need to press the 3rd button here. I go down to quit. I press the 1st button to select it, down to shut down, and then again to select, I want to shut down. And I wait until this tells me AV up in the the corner of the screen, and that way I know that the Raspberry Pi has shut down, and now I can turn off the entire cabinet. The reason I need to do that is because the Raspberry Pi is running Linux, and if I don't shut it down that way, you'll end up corrupting the file system after shutting it down 2 or 3 times without doing it properly. But that's the reason why. But what I'll do is a little montage of some of the games running on this system, and then we'll head down to the basement again. Okay, so to give you an example of one of the disadvantages of setting up a screen this way. It works great in the portrait format for games like Pacman, Dig Dug, Mr. Do, and for many others, older type games. But for some of the newer ones that use the regular format, you'll see that the screen is much reduced. In R-Type here, for example, the screen is only visible from here to here. If the screen were turned the other way, it'd take up the whole thing. So I've got a much smaller screen for most of the newer games. But really, it doesn't matter. I mean, the system works away absolutely fantastically, and this resembles a real Pacman cabinet, more or less, the way it's set up. Now, so I suppose the question really, well, one of the questions I had was, are there any improvements I could make to that cabinet to make it look a little better or to make it work a little better? And actually there are quite a few. I've got that power supply in the back of it that has plenty of juice still left in it that I could put out to other things. And I noticed that there is for sale now coin buttons, you know, like they look like the little thingies that accepted the coins back in the day, but they're actually buttons with lead in them. So I could put those on that little piece of black wood that I put on the front of the door on the arcade cabinet, where you would put in coins, and they could be wired up to the little USB controllers so that pressing them would work as coin insertion, and also back into the ATX power supply to make them light up as well. So that'd be a nice little addition to make it look more like a real arcade cabinet. And going in that vein a little bit further as well, buttons and joysticks are available with LEDs in them. They could equally be powered in exactly the same way from the ATX power supply, and there are even LED controllers that'll make the buttons flash in different patterns and whatnot, while it isn't being used to kind of make it kind of a pleasing aesthetic attract mode, I suppose. But that's all bells and whistles that you could do if you wanted to. Now, when it comes to the actual use of the thing, I'm using a Raspberry Pi B Plus, so it's like the most basic model of Raspberry Pi, and I had to overclock it to 1 gigahertz in order to get it to work properly. And it works very well. I'm happy out with it. But if I was building it like nowadays, I'd probably go for a Raspberry Pi 3 or 4. Or really, if you didn't want to fool around too much with Raspberry Pi and all that kind of thing, you just wanted some that work out of the box, you could have a look for one of those Pandora's boxes. Now, I've never really used any of those before, but apparently what they seem to be is a kind of a box that you can buy on eBay or whatever, and it's got everything built into it. All you have to do is connect a TV and some form of joystick controller using a JAMA interface, and you've pretty much got your arcade cabinet like that. That'll replace your Raspberry Pi. All the games are already on it. Everything's more or less already configured and it'll just work. So those are little things maybe I could do to improve it. But to be honest, the cabinet's up there. It's been working away fine for the last almost 4 years now, and I'm not going to fool around with it too much. That's why I haven't updated it or anything. If it's not broke, don't fix it, you know. But that's it for the video for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope it was worth the wait. I know you've been waiting quite some time while I was taking my little break. But yeah, the next video will be out. I don't know when exactly. Hopefully it'll be out soon enough, but I'm not going to try and follow any kind of a regime anymore. It'll come out when it comes out. And until then, I say play plenty of games, enjoy yourselves, and we'll talk to you on the next video. So until then, have a great time, and bye-bye.